Hey everyone, so thank you for tuning in to the Banh Mi Chronicles podcast. Happy AAPI Heritage Month. By the way, so for my next guest that you'll listen to here, I made a slight error in calling our next guest Dr. Guzman. It's actually Dr. De Guzman, Dr. Jonar de Guzman. So my apologies there, and I hope you really enjoy this episode. It's very informative. Please feel free to share it. This is in regarding to how we should consider our health, specifically for those dealing with diabetes, hypertension, and any cardiovascular issues that affect our bodies. And I think this is something that we really need to talk about in our AAPI communities as a whole. So, yeah, thank you so much. And I hope that you continue to enjoy the rest of this month. And yeah, stay tuned for my little episode to wrap up AAPI Heritage Month. See ya. Okay. Hey everyone, so welcome to the Banh Mi Chronicles podcast. So I'm joined with Dr. Jonar de Guzman. Dr. Guzman is a board certified physician in internal medicine and lifestyle medicine, certified health and meditation coach, and founder of Fort Truth Health. Through his diabetes reset protocol program, he helps Asians reverse insulin resistance and reclaim their health through sustainable lifestyle change. A former hospitalist and partner at Providence Medical Associates, he now hosts the Glass Health Half Healthy, sorry again, Glass Health Half Healthy, ooh, that's a mouthful, podcast recognized among Board Vital's top 25 medical podcasts in 2025. He also serves as director of Sedona Butterfly Effect, a nonprofit honoring his late daughter and supporting children at risk for or living with cerebral palsy. So I am really glad that I came across your work, and I think what you're doing right now is very critical to our own Asian American communities because it's something that has always been kind of under the surface, or in a way hasn't been. I mean, at least from my point of view, it hasn't been like deeply explored because I think that
Mm.
there's so many different factors of what affects our health. And I mean, I think
Yeah,
about the social determinants of health, also like the environment that we were raised in,
yeah,
um, the intergenerational trauma that comes with it, um, the access to resources in the communities that you live in. So there's a number of factors, and I feel like it's really good to kind of find a way to really step back and think about how these things do affect the conditions that we or our family members experience. And so it is Asian American Month, and I think it's not only important to celebrate our identity and culture, but also to create health awareness about our communities that can keep us sustainable and with stronger health outcomes. And, I deal with, pre-diabetes and hypertension issues. So I'm definitely doing my little work on it, but it's also something that I think about a lot because, I had a younger brother who passed away. He had kidney failure and did not, unfortunately, live a very sustainable did not adapt to a healthy lifestyle, which really
yeah.
only um, caused his passing. And while his twin brother runs the Chicago Marathon, is very religious about his own health. So it's
Mm,
it's basically a yin and yang.
yeah.
And so I'm really glad to have you on, Dr. Guzman. And first of all, how are you doing with your work so far and with your podcast, having to do consultations with clients and doing your content creation and so forth? It seems like there's so much going on in your world.
There is, but first of all, Randy, thank you for having me on your show. I appreciate it very much and giving voice to, fellow Asian Americans like myself. So, kudos to what you're doing and, keep up the strong work you do through this podcast. The other thing is like my condolences about your brother.
Hmm.
That's got to be difficult, especially since he's younger.
Hmm. Yeah, and actually because the family history has been very difficult because my mom's a stroke survivor of 2012, so we're 14 years, and since then, even though she is disabled, she's she really keeps up with her diet very well. I mean, I think that it's kind of amazing because people who have survived near fatal strokes, the lifespan after that is not very optimistic, or at least within the 10-year frame, it tends to be very challenging. And, my mom is going to be 70 this year, and it's kind of amazing how resilient she is after the last 14 years being
Yeah.
not only um, careful with their diet, but also being mentally, socially active. And so
Yeah.
I think that's also very important to note that. And I wonder about what you have observed in the work in the Asian American communities and what you have noticed, especially like between like the South Asian communities, Southeast Asian, East Asian communities. I mean, there's a whole different intersections that you're kind of like, toying with here. But what have you
Right.
been observing in the communities that you have worked with?
Well, so it's complex, right? Because there's multi cultural angles to this under the umbrella of like Asians. And it's interesting too if you compare Asians generally, like Asian adults compared to like the US population, we make up about like 10% of the US Asian adults. But in terms of um, diagnosis of type 2 diabetes, 40%, we're more than 40% more likely to be diagnosed with diabetes than Caucasians, and at even like lower BMIs than um, you know, what you typically would consider someone who has kind of like a multitude of chronic diseases, either overweight or obese, that the sort. But like even Asians who are thinner, they can develop what's called visceral fat. That's that fat that wraps around the organs.
Mhm.
And there's two types of fat when we talk about fat, commonly, right? There's the subcutaneous fat, which is sort of that fat that you can see from the outside, and that's what people typically associate fat with. But there is this second type, which is actually the more toxic type that wraps around our organs. And unfortunately, Asians are at a higher risk for developing this sort of visceral fat than our Caucasian counterparts, even African counterparts, right?
Mhm.
And amongst those, actually, Indians, so in like South Asians specifically, right? And Filipinos, we are at the highest, we're like the highest prevalence when
Mhm.
it comes to this. So I'm Filipino. This applies to me very much so. And so, there's theories behind why that might happen or might have happened. So, like with our ancestors, they were in areas and pockets of the world where there was a lot of constant, like civil unrest or
Mhm.
like warring countries, warring societies, in addition to famine. And so the theory behind it is that we Asians have developed this storage of fat during to like last us during those times where food was not abundant, where food was scarce, right? At the same time, too, muscle is one of the most metabolically active cells in the body. And what that means is like it requires more energy to survive and do work than other cells. So because of that, like our body types, we don't have as much muscle comparatively to other
Mhm.
ethnicities. And so the combination of the two, it's like it's a recipe for disaster when it comes to not even just diabetes, but high blood pressure, high cholesterol, heart disease, you name it, down the road for the chronic diseases. And so that's kind of the pattern that we're seeing nowadays here in the United States. And
Yeah.
the problem too is that like a lot of these treatments that are geared towards treating, for example, prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, these are Eurocentric approaches. Like these were based off of people in studies that were Caucasian.
Mhm.
And so they developed these methods and specifically medications to treat that underlying disease process. But I think what gets lost in it is that maybe those treatment approaches don't fully work for us because of the fact that we have a different type of metabolism. that we put on visceral fat more so than your, for example, Caucasian or, African counterparts.
Hmm. I think that's it's an interesting observation too, because I wonder about what it means when, I mean, you bring up like different factors, especially with famine, where our ancestors have experienced. I know, like being Vietnamese and Cambodian, especially
Hmm.
in the last 50 years,
Hmm.
um, like my parents experienced like systemic violence, and it
Yeah.
was also affecting their access to getting medical resources. I mean,
Yep.
there was issues about the quality of food, if and the scarcity of food, and also um the lack of trust with the community because of, I mean, like, you look at other countries, like, what was going on during the Japanese colonization with the medical experiments, and how that also in some ways um amplifies a lot of the fears and the reluctance to going to see a doctor, but
Yeah.
also like the language barrier. But like, for a lot of refugees that come into the US, or recent immigrants that have had to, flee for a number of reasons, whether it's due violence or economic circumstances and what have you. A lot of the resettlement happens more in the city areas, and low income neighborhoods where there's food deserts, where there is a lack of
Mm-hmm.
food education,
Hmm.
there's a lack of proper health care, and so, and also obviously the language barriers, I mean, which also plays
Hmm.
into that. So,
Right.
um, all of these factors, in a way, only heightens like the risk that a lot of our communities are going through.
Yep.
So, yes, I'm very curious about um like the thoughts on what type 2 diabetes mean for this particular community, and also in the food that we eat, and also how we, navigate our own blood sugar, our A1C, on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. Yeah. Great question. I think it becomes much more challenging in modern life, right? Going back to this Eurocentric approach of diabetes treatment, and even before the treatment diagnosis, right? If you are looking for folks that fit the build, quote unquote, who might have diabetes, they might not be looking at Asians because they're like, oh, that particular body composition, you know, usually is associated with type 2 diabetes or high blood pressure, high cholesterol. But someone who is, there's a term actually for it. It's called TOFI. So thin on the outside, fat on the inside. And the fat
Mm,
on the inside is that visceral fat that I'm talking about. A
mm,
doctor might not be looking at that person, that Asian person, and be like, oh, they probably don't have diabetes. I don't need to screen them. So what ends up happening? They actually do, and they get caught way later.
mm,
And so now it's kind of like you're kind of backpedaling and
mm,
swimming upstream, so to speak, for that those particular body type Asians.
mm,
And at the same time, too, you mentioned the food for us Asians, rice, noodles, dumplings, breads. They're not just food for us. They're memories, right? They're part of our culture. Celebrations, like it doesn't
mm,
matter. It could just be like family get-togethers on the weekends, but even bigger ones, Lunar New Year, Christmas, just you name it. And so it's part of the identity. And so when you're talking about managing the diabetes, there's this prevailing attitude about limiting your carbs and or just cutting them out altogether. And I think that falls on deaf ears for a lot of Asians. And
mm,
the thing is, it's not even just Asian. There's a lot of other cultures too outside of
mhm,
the Asian umbrella culture where carbs are the main part of the meal. So it's not even asking them to like stop that. It's like, oh, stop celebrating your culture, disconnecting with it. But the thing is, like, you don't have to. Like, you can celebrate your heritage and health can still coexist in harmony,
Mm,
you know? And so what I've what I've come upon is, and just going back, like I was pre-diabetic. This was so when I was in medical training, this was like 10 plus years ago.
mm,
Medical training is very rigorous. I did it out here in Southern California. And you're working a lot of hours. It's high pressure environment. You mentioned I was a hospitalist, so I worked
mhm,
caring for sick, hospitalized patients like inside the hospital. And a lot of times those are life or death situations. And so that's what we were faced with every single day. And I didn't have much time to eat. So I turned to convenient but very unhealthy foods. And sometimes I would just drown in the foods. And I even used alcohol too to like
mhm,
drown out the emotions. And it's just a very unhealthy way of living. And, I
mhm,
found myself January 1st, 2016. This was New Year's Day. I had just gotten off shift at the hospital. I stepped on the scale and I was like 40 plus pounds
mm,
overweight. And for like my body type, and we talked about BMI, which is body mass index,
mhm,
that even that scale is built for Caucasian body types.
mhm, mhm,
That actually doesn't apply to us Asians because in terms of like our stature, in terms of our muscle build, and so someone with, a BMI of 25 who's Asian, that might not apply in terms of like how unhealthy they are. But I was way past that scale. Like I think I was in the obese range.
mm,
And I looked at myself in the mirror and I was like, how could I be giving medical advice to patients when I'm not even following my own
mm,
advice?
mm,
And so, yeah, I did a lot of reading. I did a lot of research on healthier ways of living that could help reverse this process of the excess pounds, but also like the pre-diabetes. And what I stumbled upon is like, there's so many extreme dieting out there, crash diets, um, whether it's ketogenic diet, carnivore diet, 100% vegan diet, like those are very rigid ways of trying to get back to better health, but they fall short in the long run because they're unsustainable. And my message, which I teach all the folks that I've cared for, whether it's patients and currently right now in my health coaching program, I have a diabetes reset protocol program specifically designed for Asians because the first person I helped was myself. And there was nothing like this out there for us. And so I thought to myself, well, hell, I'll just create my own for other folks. And so that's what I've been doing and transition out of the healthcare model to start my own thing. And I think it can be done without extremes. I think it can be done without, letting go of your heritage and still being able to get to better health, and both can exist in harmony. You don't have to like turn your back on your culture for good.
mhm. I think about, being in America, having the Western centric uh, medical lens here, but also have you connected with like Asian physicians, Asian health professionals in Asian countries, and what have you learned from them, like in terms of how they treat diabetes and how they treat um, like our body types?
Yeah, very good question. So I'd say I've had limited contact with those folks, but just doing reading and looking at trends like over the years, I think because of globalization and
Mhm.
America's influence on modern culture, which includes a lot of food, right? We're talking about fast foods, we're talking about like big chain restaurants. In that has been transported, exported over to all these countries, and especially in Asia. And so what's happening is, yeah, there is chronic disease epidemic everywhere. It's worldwide now. Whereas before, maybe like 10, 20 years ago, or even beyond, it wasn't like that. And so, we're all faced with this challenge of what do we do with this burden of chronic disease? Yeah, we're talking about diabetes, but man, we're talking about all the chronic diseases,
Hmm.
high cholesterol, high blood pressure, heart disease, just down the line. And yeah, I think one of the places to start really is the nutrition piece. It's not the only, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. You have to look at the other pillars of health that I typically focus on when I help my clients through the diabetes reset protocol. But I think that nutrition's such a big part of this because that is what has caused the chronic disease from the get-go. Like if you look at the way that our ancestors used to eat food, the majority of the plate was actually whole plant foods, veggies, fruits, and meats was sort of like the garnish, you know? And you had your carbs too, but like that has now completely flipped in modern society, right? Doesn't matter what culture you're talking about. The main dish now is the meat. And
Hmm.
the plants have become kind of like this shrunken side dish. And that alone is one of the biggest factors is like the way that the proportions of the foods have changed in our modern diet. Yeah, and then not to mention processed foods. I mean, this is like a relatively brand new thing for us. 50, 100 years ago, there's nowhere near the level of processed foods we have nowadays.
Hmm.
So it's like the combination of those two when we're talking about nutrition.
Hmm.
And then, apart from food, it's like all the drinks and snacks.
Hmm.
Boba. Boba is a big one,
Hmm.
right? For Asians. But yeah, just down the line. So yeah, it's everywhere, unfortunately, these
Hmm.
processed foods. And it's like what can you do to improve your health? I think that like it helps to just start simply. I tell all the people that I typically help when they first enter my program is like, you got to keep things simple. A lot of what we do every day as human beings, we tend to overcomplicate things.
Hmm.
And oftentimes that gets us in a point of overwhelm. And then we don't do anything at all. I think just starting simply and moving in that fashion towards healthier eating, I think is the way to go. Like you got to start with sort of the low-hanging fruit first.
Yeah, and also I'm curious about where does exercise, fitness start to come into play, especially for our own communities, and how we manage sleep and how we
Yeah.
manage work-life balance and when we eat, when should
Yes.
we not be eating,
Yes.
how much water should we be consuming,
Yeah.
what happens when we drink. I mean, for a while I have been drinking like uh black coffee, and sometimes I would a cold brew coffee, and sometimes I would treat myself to a Vietnamese coffee, and I that's a guilt of mine also because it really perks me up. But I've been kind of weaning off of a lot of it lately, and seeing my blood pressure like go down significantly because of that. So
Good.
I'm curious about where the fitness and also where like just like the ritual or the a way of when we eat, how we eat, what we drink,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, all great points and great things to bring up. I think that when you're talking about health, it isn't just the food,
Mm.
right? It is like everything that you do on a daily basis, from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to bed, including your sleep. And so I think the best approach is a holistic approach where you're looking at everything. Like I mentioned food before. Food is necessary. It's like one of the biggest factors when it comes to these sort of um, triggered chronic diseases. Almost and I don't want to put blame on any one person, but it self-inflicted because
Mhm.
none of us knew better. right? We're just
Mhm.
trying to survive, and these are the foods that we grew up knowing, and some of it is like a cost thing too. Some of it's a comfort thing as well. So we didn't know better, but like these are oftentimes the triggers for chronic disease. But it's necessary but not sufficient. You have to look at the other elements, like you just brought up, movement on a day-to-day basis. Like, if we compare ourselves to our ancestors were out in the field, they were moving their bodies all day long. Nowadays, we're sitting at these desks in front of a computer screen for like 7 8. Our bodies were not meant to live that way. We were meant to be moving around. That's how our biological bodies were built. They were built to like be in nature and move around more. So that's like a big one. And the thing is, you don't have to necessarily like go to the gym. You have to find times of the day to move your body more. Maybe it is setting an alarm for yourself, like every 60 minutes to just get up and walk around for like 5 minutes or even less, but like moving your body around more matters a whole lot in this. And I build in strategic movement for the folks that I work with because what's been proven, like the studies show that like moving, especially after you eat a meal, doesn't just help with blood pressure, but blood sugar and your mood, your overall mood. And the more you do it, like 10 minutes is better than five, and 15 minutes is better than 10 minutes. You get better stabilization of your blood pressure and your blood sugar after like walking after a meal. So building in strategic movement, especially around mealtime, is super important if you're wanting to improve your health when it comes to your blood sugars and blood pressure and even mood, right? And then the other stuff too, like stress. Stress is a big one that we don't really talk too much about. I feel like the pandemic has helped to like open up the conversation, but I mean, especially in Asian communities, I feel like we still have ways to go when it comes to this particular topic. And I think that with modern life, there's so many triggers and stressors that weren't in existence 100 years ago. We have these devices that constantly alarm us about like the 24 news cycle or like email notifications or social media notifications. And so we're bombarded with just all these like messages and warnings and alarm bells, and our nervous system doesn't know better.
Mhm.
Like when we were Neanderthals roaming the earth, we have this beautiful ability to sense danger. And when danger approaches, the alarm bells go off in our body. There's something called the sympathetic nervous system, and that's kind of your fight or flight response. And so these mechanisms helped us evade predators, evade danger, like way back when. But now in modern life, that works against us because our bodies don't know different, right? Like they sense danger with these alarms and notifications, and we're constantly hit with these like stressors throughout the day, and none of us are taught skills to be able to effectively manage them. So what ends up happening is there's like this higher level of chronic stress that's never relieved because we're never taught the skills to do it. And so there's a hormone called cortisol that's
Mhm.
elevated because of stress, and that can lead to increased blood sugars, increased insulin resistance, increased blood pressure, so on and so forth down the road. It leads to weight gain also. So like that's another big thing that I harp on with the folks that I help is like coming up with micro practices, like even if it's 5 minutes a day, to effectively move through your day in a more intentional way rather than being on autopilot the whole time,
Mhm.
you know? And then
Mhm.
the last one is sleep. Like that's not the least one. I would say that's probably one of the most important ones. Your body needs at least 7 hours of sleep a night, quality sleep. Because if you're not doing that, what ends up happening is the sleep period for anyone's bodies is a time for your metabolism and the hormones to kind of recalibrate and rebalance. So if you're not giving your body enough time, what ends up happening is hormone levels stay elevated or lower. Cortisol being one of the big ones. Cortisol remains elevated if you're sleeping like less than 7 hours of sleep. So it puts you at higher risk of, high blood sugars, insulin resistance, high cholesterol, heart disease. So it's so important, imperative that you get at least 7 hours sleep a night. I'd say we're chronically under that as
Mm.
a society. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm also curious about the caffeine intake, especially like if you go to work every day, we're having to wake up, and in the past I've had to use coffee to keep me really awake, because sometimes I will only have like 5 hours of sleep, because I'm very anxious, and I would need it to function, but I also know that there's a crash effect, but it also doesn't help my own heart, by doing that. And
Hmm.
and I'm curious about what ways can you try um to avoid having to be so dependent on caffeine.
Yeah. This is a big one, right? For many of us out there. And I think you have to start with the sleep, really, because part of the reason why we're chronically tired is because we're not resting enough. And I know for a lot of folks, sleeping 7 hours might not be realistic, like off the bat, but you gotta start incrementally and find ways of better time management so you can get to sleep earlier and you can get that adequate sleep. Now, that being said, irrespective of that, I think there's good strategy around caffeine use. And so, I actually just went over this with some of my folks in my program. We talked about the 5 morning rituals that can help just better start the day. That's based off of what the Japanese have been doing for like centuries. And so I don't know if you've come upon this on social media or read on it, but like one of them is hydrating first before you do caffeine. Because what ends up happening is you have this neurotransmitter that ends up building up during sleep that needs to be cleared by the body before you take caffeine because the enzyme that breaks down that it's called adenosine specifically is what I'm referring to
Mhm,
that breaks down adenosine that same receptor can be occupied taken up by the caffeine.
mhm,
So if you're drinking caffeine right off the bat, right when you wake up,
mhm,
what ends up happening is like that adenosine just sits in your body until the caffeine wears off. And then guess what happens? At like 2 or 3 p.m., the adenosine's still there and you start feeling tired and sleepy. So like you got to give your body ideally about 90 minutes after you wake up. So from the time that you get up in the morning to the time that you take in caffeine. That's probably the biggest strategy I would say for allowing your body to utilize caffeine efficiently, if that
mhm,
makes sense.
mhm,
And so the other part too is like avoiding caffeine, after a certain time, like make 2 p.m. the cutoff. For some folks, it's
mhm,
got to be like at 1 or even 12 p.m. because that's going to affect your sleep down the road.
mhm,
Right? Like when you get to bed, like you might be wide awake because there's still caffeine circulating in your system. So I would say that like if you're drinking coffee, try to drink it at least 90 minutes after you wake up, and then no later than 2 or 3 p.m. should be your last caffeinated drink. And if you're really hell bent on drinking something, I'd stick to like, herbal tea in the afternoon or even early evening. That way you're drinking something to kind of supplant that like ritual of like drinking something warm, but you're not taking in the caffeine that will keep you up at night. I would say those are probably the two biggest things. Yeah, or three biggest
Mm,
things.
thank
Yeah.
you for that. And when I think about the Southeast Asian community, I mean, we're
Mhm.
all Southeast Asian. I know in the Filipino community, there is a lot of meat heavy
Oh,
portions, and very
yes.
carb heavy, and then
Yep.
also for the Vietnamese side of things, we also love using a lot of sweets too. We love our desserts, we love our coffee. Um, I am curious about like when we're not trying to cut out everything from our own culture, but what does that look like? What do we supplement it with? Does the supplement vitamins or, the stuff that you see from Costco or GNC, or what about the abundance of certain vegetables that we need to like
Yes.
implement, with our dishes? Or
Yep.
what kind of rice should we be looking to use more of, or what should we use less of? I mean, I know it's like there's no universal answer, obviously, so I'm
Yeah.
curious about what that looks like.
I think the overall approach, like this goes back to what I was telling you about before with like the way our ancestors ate, flipping the script in terms of the proportions we are eating, making your plate more of plants and less of the processed foods, less of the meat. Okay. So one thing I'm going to tell you, and especially when it comes to insulin resistance, whether that's prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, very important for many of us out there that are listening to this that are Asian, right? Managing blood sugars does not equate to insulin resistance reversal. And what I mean by that is we're told this all the time. You go to a doctor, you see a lot of like health and wellness stuff online. When it comes to diabetes, it's lowering the carb intake or cutting out all the carbs forever for good. And not only is that like an unsustainable approach and not helpful for us Asians that do like to still eat carbs, but it's not complete. Carbs don't cause insulin resistance. They don't cause prediabetes or type 2. They're a symptom of insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is actually due to inflammation, chronic inflammation, that's caused by some of these foods that I mentioned, the processed foods, a lot of fat, like unhealthy fats, I'm talking about specifically, that are often present in processed meats.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I think the overall approach that you have to be able to take is minimize those inflammatory foods and maximize the whole plant foods like our ancestors did. I'm going to give you an example. So there is a book, but also a documentary based off of this book by Dan Buettner. It's called The Blue Zones. I don't know if you've ever heard of it.
Oh, I have not. No, I have
Yeah.
not. But yeah.
So for folks out there listening that haven't, there's a book called The Blue Zones, and they turned it into a documentary called Living Past 100 or to 100 on Netflix. Okay. And what Dan Buettner, he's the author of this book. He gathered all these researchers because what he noticed traveling around the world, there's these certain pockets of societies that the people live past 100.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what are they in? They're living healthy, like without chronic disease, without diabetes, high blood pressure, you name it. And so, they gathered information from each of these societies. One of them was in Okinawa, Japan. Another one is here, actually, in California, specifically, Loma Linda, California. So, they gathered what ended up being nine common lifestyle factors. They call it the power of nine. And then, in terms of nutrition, one of them was this approach called plant slant, which is essentially eating plant forward. The majority of food that you're eating is plants. And that's not to say like they were 100% vegan, like they still ate their spattering of meats, but they are basically eating like how our ancestors ate. And so if you can get to that point, that's overall, I would say that is the most practical approach when it comes to eating healthier.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I would say, like, realistically, what you can do is just add in a couple of vegetables or a couple of fruits each day throughout, like, the next week, for example, and see how your body feels eating more whole foods. That
Mm-hmm.
would probably be the, like, just, I would say, overall approach when it comes to like I want to start today, I want to start eating healthier. Like look into the foods that you actually enjoy eating that are plant foods, whether that is, spinach, whether that are like some of the fruits that might be like lower glycemic index, so like berries, for example, but doing it in a way that, gives you joy again with the foods that you're eating.
Yeah, I also think about sodium versus potassium, like, trying to up the potassium to kind of like lower the sodium. I'm curious about like someone who, deals with hypertension, in my family.
Mhm.
What does that look like? Because I know our foods are also very sodium based. We like our fish sauce, we like our soy sauce and whatnot. But like, what's also a good balance for that too, with potassium especially?
Yeah, I would say that just lowering your salt intake overall is your best bet.
Mhm.
Now, this approach is, you know, built here in the United States. It's called the DASH diet. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but
Vaguely.
it is a diet that helps folks that have high blood pressure work through it in a way where you're limiting the amount of sodium
Mhm.
that you're taking in daily, sodium being
Mhm.
salt, right?
Mhm.
And so, I think that being mindful of how much salt you're putting in your food matters a whole lot. I think that even if you can just cut out 50% of the sodium that you're already eating on a daily basis,
Mhm.
that will help drastically. If you're using regular soy sauce, using the reduced soy
Mhm.
sauce. And for every meal, if you're adding extra salt in there, like try not to do that.
Mhm.
Try to limit your sodium intake daily. And yeah, you mentioned it with the sauces. Some of this stuff that we eat, whether it's in restaurants or, pre-prepared meals from grocery stores, they're chock filled with what I call SOS, salt, oil, sugar, like added
Mhm.
sugars, added salts. And you're better off eating food that you know what you're putting in there. Meaning, like you're eating food from home, you're preparing it yourself.
Mhm.
But like even if you're preparing it yourself, oftentimes those like higher sodium sorts of foods you might be eating exist in sauces. So if you can make your own sauce or at least know how much sodium's in there, make it your rule to use only like 50% of what you were doing and then start reducing it like week by week.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, as we start to wrap up, first of
hmm
all, this has been a great conversation. I think that there's so much to unpack here. I'm glad that you're able to give us like a nice overview of what it looks like for our communities. What advice would you give for someone that's just trying to get off to a good start and to have like consistency? What does consistency look like in the next 90 days?
Yeah, no, that is a very great question. I think what I would say is starting out with why you want to do this in the first place.
Mhm.
And this is what I start with everyone I first start working with. You need to figure out what your deep purpose is of doing this. Like I often talk about like, or especially in our modern culture when we're talking about getting healthy, we often talk about the what, the diet, the exercise. We don't talk enough about the why. Like why are we doing this? Because the thing is, if you want to change around your health habits, you have this existing health habit pattern that is very automatic. To be able to break that, you need some type of passion and motivation behind why you're doing it. And so getting to the heart of like why you want to get healthier, what is that for you? For me, it's I want to live a longer life for my kids. I have two
Mhm.
young kids. And, we lost a daughter back in 2023, and
Mhm.
I know the meaning and the sort of, preciousness of life.
Mhm.
And so I use that every single day that I live my life in everything that I do, whether it's I'm helping people, but ultimately like my own health, right? So digging deep to figure that out, I think is really important because once you do that, then that is like your boundless source of energy to be able to like be on the path of healthier living. Okay. So
Mhm.
I'd say start there first. Like, why do you want to do this? And once you figure that out, whether it's for, your family, your parents, your kids, um, to live a longer life without feeling ill, feeling sick, yeah, more power to you. Once you figure that out, then you can start working on this stuff. And I would start simply, just start with nutrition. You know, pick pick like one or two things that you do like an inventory of the next 7 days of what you're eating. Just simply look at the food you're taking in, whether it's food or drink. Take a log of everything. Figure out, oh, what I didn't even realize I'm eating. Half the time we don't even realize the foods we're eating really.
Yeah.
Because going back to my point about the health habits, like these are automatic old patterns. We don't realize they're totally just ingrained in our day to day. And unless we take note and we're aware of those things, we can't change them. So there might be like two or three things that you can be like, oh, I don't even know why I started eating those chips at night. Like throwing that out, like getting rid of it in your pantry and just like throwing it out. Because I often say to the folks that I help, the foods in your house end up in your mouth. And so like just eliminating some of the unnecessary, unhealthy foods is a great way to start. And then the other part too is just getting in more movement on a daily basis. Start with like a 5-minute walk, either after work or after lunch, and then just start from there. See if you can do that for the next couple days. And if you can do it consistently, 5 minutes, then up it to 10 minutes and just increase it from there to 30 or 60 minutes. But I think starting small, simple, that creates sustainability.
Mm. Thank you so much for this amazing conversation. Where can people find you and anything that you're currently working on right now?
Yeah, thank you. So I am most active on social media on Instagram,
Mhm.
Facebook, and TikTok. I'm at the same exact like moniker username, and it is reverse diabetes doc. On TikTok, I have about 15,000 or so follows. And this is relatively new that I created these social media platforms. So if you want, you can follow me for, more health tips. And I'd love the support too.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. And also, I hope that everyone for AAPI month, celebrates and honors themselves and each other safely. And I hope that people get to check out your work and follow you on social media because I think this is very insightful. So, really, thank you so much for just giving us a lot of wisdom here.
Thank you very much for having me, Randy. I appreciate it. And giving us Asians a platform to, speak to a larger audience than we otherwise normally would not be able to. So thank you for all that you do.